So, this is video lecture 24. We have had some time in class to do some playing around with some of these Baroque forms, and so the next 3 video lectures will link to what we did in class and what we will do in class coming up in the next week or so, and link to your listening. I'm going to give you the lecture material, and then you are going to listen to the musical listing list, and you should see, oh yeah, the point is that you listen to something and say, oh my gosh, that was in the lecture, even without me saying, look at measure 2, do you see measure 2? You should be able to draw these conclusions. So I'm sure you'll do a fine job. Let's see, so this lecture is about instrumental forms, especially those forms that use continuo, which is almost all of them. And I thought I would just start off, I lost my page before I even started, start off with this little quote from Poliska's great book, Baroque Music. He says, he's talking about the mid-17th century, back to the beginning of our Baroque period, but I think what he says applies throughout the period. So I'm going to quote this first paragraph, page 145. He says, the music of the mid-17th century, mid-1600s, strikes a happy balance between freshness and maturity. It exudes confidence without self-consciousness and enjoys a certain homogeneity without conformity. In other words, people are writing the same kinds of things in the same kinds of styles, but there is a certain amount of freshness. I think that's actually potentially true throughout the Baroque period, although I know I have friends who say, oh, all Vivaldi concertos sound the same. So maybe we lose some of that spontaneity or freshness as the period goes on. That's often why we end up shortly having a new style period. But I think it's pretty true throughout the Baroque period. The idea of monody, a single melody, and a bass line with the figured bass technique. Melody and bass line proceed with purpose and clarity. They join in an effective partnership. The bass part, now typically active and linear, that moving bass line, occasionally competes with or enters into dialogue with the upper parts, those melody parts. Sequences, imitations, and repetitions give to the expansion of motives a logical and fluid continuity. So sequences aren't just like cookie cutter, do it again at a different pitch level, but it allows the music to flow and develop. Remember, in the Renaissance, by the way, sequences, maybe I didn't say this, sequences were not a thing. That kind of repetition would have been frowned upon as boring. Here, sequences are used as a spark for creativity. Harmony is varied, but its digressions are curbed by a unified tonal scheme. We are in a key. We may modulate from that key in the course of a piece. We may modulate to different keys, but by the end of the movement, we will come back to that same tonic, that idea of departure from tonic, return to tonic. At last, a consistent and distinct style has been achieved that may be called, for lack of a better name, Baroque. We see a continuing refinement of this Baroque style without really much severe change until perhaps the 1740s and 50s, when we have hints of a new style, a galant style, that is kind of a precursor to some of the ideals and goals of the classical period that will be our final period for this semester. Hang on, only a few weeks left. Let's talk a little bit about instruments. The instrument par excellence in instrumental genres was the violin, not the Renaissance-favored viol da gamba, which was a fretted instrument always held between the legs and played this way, and the bow, by the way, would have been held with an underhand grip like this. Instead, the violin, or the viol da braccia, as it started off its name, the arm viol, was held in the arm, and notice the bow grip changes from this to this. Sorry, string players, I'm totally, horn player, what am I doing? This change in bow style and the lack of frets, there are no frets to press your fingers against. This means that you have a tighter, you tune the strings tighter. They're wound tighter than viol strings are. They are not yet metal strings. That technology is coming later. These are still gut strings, but they are attuned to a higher tension. They're pressed directly down onto the fingerboard instead of onto a fret. Your overhand grip also affects the amount of pressure and where in the bow sound, when and where the intensity of the sound happens. At some point, we'll also recurve the bow instead of this way. The bow becomes curved as we know it today, this way. That will change the quality of sound as well. Quality of sound. So this pressure and tighter strings means a louder, cleaner tone. I sort of feel like the person that wrote that little description is very favored towards Baroque things. Bowing techniques change drastically. As I mentioned in a previous video, somebody like Lully is able to actually say to his players, we're going to all bow the same way, not just to look nice, although I'm sure that was an added benefit, but because this new bowing technique allows actually more sparkling, clear articulations, attacks, phrase endings, phrase beginnings. These kinds of things suddenly become possible to do, and so bowing all together means you are all doing them the same way. We can hear it. It becomes more obvious to the ear. The instrument family of the violin then extends downward to viola, cello, and what we know as the double bass in English. String players, again, I know the development is slightly more complicated than that, but be kind to the rest of us who are not string players. So we lose the softer sort of consort sounds of the fretted stringed instruments, and we end up with these new sort of pyrotechnic instruments that are the ones that we are familiar with today in the symphony orchestra. So that shows you how significant a turn the string family took there. I know those of you who are string players today feel like that was like manifest destiny. Like, of course, that was the only way it could have gone. Other instruments that were favored as solo instruments would have been the transverse flute, as opposed to the vertical flute, the recorder. Mine are all, I'm moving right now, so mine are all packed away. I don't have them to show you. But the transverse flute, as we know it today. The oboe, as we know it largely today, although without quite so many keys. Same on the flute, there's no keys. There's maybe one little key at the end. And the cornetto. Cornetto, it sounds like a cornet. Let me describe it and I'll show you a picture. Cornetto is a wooden instrument. It's carved out of a piece of wood. It's a hollow piece of wood with finger holes, but you buzz it with a mouthpiece. It is the reason that trumpet players, you have all this piccolo trumpet repertoire from the Baroque period. While the piccolo clarino trumpet was coming along in the 1600s, before people were really good at shaping the brass instruments that way, you would play on these wooden, slightly curved cornetto or zinc, and you're playing in this high register, the music that you would play piccolo trumpet stuff on today. A cornetto is not as loud as a trumpet. It's maybe more akin to a Baroque oboe in volume. We have some genres here in this. I'm going to talk about 3 genres, again, as quickly as possible. The sonata, the concerto, and the symphonie. So I'm going to start with the sonata. The sonata is not a sonata form. It is a collection, a multi-movement collection of pieces. It started off its life as simply a thing to be heard, as opposed to a thing to be sung. A sonata is without words. A cantata is with words. Sonatas were originally, in the 1600s, beginning of our Baroque period, were originally lumped with this sinfonia and the canzona. Sinfonia, canzona, as sort of instrumental things. Things you could play, for example, in church when there's silent bits in the Mass, like after they read a lesson and the person is walking all the way back to where they sit. Or during the offertory, when they're carrying all the bread and wine and they're going to get it ready for communion. There's silence there. There's no words of the Mass to be sung, so let's fill it up with instrumental music. Sounds like today, yes. It could also, those kinds of pieces, those instrumental pieces, could also be used in secular entertainment. They're not particularly sacred. There's no sacred connotation. We just use them to fill up the time in church. Same thing, sitting around the hall in your noble lord's residence in his palace after dinner, and we need some entertainment. So we don't feel like dancing yet. Let's listen. So sonata. What I'm going to give you is sort of the high Baroque version of sonata, which goes through as many stages of development as opera did. And again, recall that I jumped all the way to the high Baroque, late Baroque version of opera. Again, all of these great paper topics that you could just dig in and really enjoy. You would find a lot of really great repertoire as you sort of go from 1600 to 1730 and 40. The sonata, as it comes to be sort of described in music history books, a multi-movement collection of works which generally alternate slow, fast movements. A movement with a slow tempo, like a pavane, a movement with a fast tempo, like a galliard. I'm picking the wrong genres. A sarabande followed by a bourrée. Slow dance, fast dance. So that's why I gave you that lecture about dances that you should have already read. There are two sonata genre types. One is the sonata da chiesa, the sonata for churches. The only difference between this and the next one is that it starts with a first movement that is not a dance form. The sonata da chiesa, the church sonata, starts with some movement that may be a slow fantasia-like introduction. It may be a French overture. Hang on to that. I'll tell you about it in about 12 minutes. Trying to be realistic. The first movement of a sonata da chiesa could be could then go from slow to fast within itself. It could have a new section that's maybe fugue-like, but it's sort of self-contained, kind of like a prelude in a way. You could think of it as, let me show you that I am here, and let's get used to the room and make sure my instrument is in tune. Kind of like we'll see in the keyboard genres, the way a prelude functions. It's sometimes called a prelude, as a matter of fact. It usually doesn't have a name besides a tempo marking. The other sonata type is called sonata da camera, the sonata for the chamber, for secular entertainment. It's the same. It's alternating movements of dance types, slow, fast, slow, fast. You can have as many as you want. But there's no first movement of, here I am arriving in the hall. That's really essentially the only difference. So people make a big deal about it. I have to say, now that I look at it back across my music history learning curve, I don't think it's that big a deal. The movements of the sonata would all consist, except for the first movement, of binary forms. That was in the written lecture. You need to know the simple and rounded binary forms. That's how each movement would be in a binary form. Each movement would clearly point to an affect and or a dance type. Either you're feeling the affect of tragedy or nobility or whatever. You're supposed to get that by inference, by the key that's used and the ornaments and the way the harmony works. Or you would say, oh, I know how to dance that, even if you wouldn't get up and dance it. These sonatas are more elaborate. They're music for listening, not music for active dancing. But people would recognize it and say, yeah, that sounds like a groovy allemande, but it's too complicated to dance. Other forms of the sonata that we think of are under the heading maybe that we would say in modern times, we'd say, oh, canzona. A canzona, a group of people playing together. This is where we get, for example, Giovanni Gabrieli writing his sonata piano e forte, where it's actually marked into the parts whether you would play loudly or softly. As a matter of fact, Gabrieli is writing in a polychoral style. He's writing for groups, two equal groups of wind players, for example, of sackbuts. You are in this balcony at the Church San Marco in Venice, the Cathedral Basilica San Marco, up in this balcony, and you are over in this balcony, and sometimes you will play apart, and we will hear this cool echo effect, because you're in a big church space. It's actually not that big, but you're separated by distance. And then when you play together, it's louder. But the idea that you could actually dictate the loud and soft, and it would work into this idea of effect of moving our emotions was a significant thing, because now look at our music. It's full of expressive indications, including dynamics. Gabrielli's instrumental canzonas and sonatas, they are simply instrumental pieces for groups of instruments. We see other composers writing music like this for wind bands, potentially. Sometimes it's called town music. People like Petzl, those of you in brass quintets, I'm sure you've played Die Bankelsänger-Lieder. This is a collection of sonatas, canzonas for wind instruments, for cornets and sackbuts. And we now play them in the modern brass quintet repertoire or brass choir repertoire. They're exactly, it just works. Great. Modern instruments, old things, doing the same old, hey, how about that? It's great. So that's where your Robert King editions of Petzl and Gabrielli and things like that would fit in. Composers of sonatas, I'll give you some names, and some will be on your listening list. I'm going to try and keep the listening list not too heavy. But some of these names might strike a note of inquiry in you, and so again, you might want to run and listen to some of these. The English composer Henry Purcell, writing early in the Baroque period and writing these very sonata forms. Arcangelo Corelli, who wrote, I said mistakenly earlier that he wrote oratorios. I think he didn't. He wrote sonatas and he wrote concerti. Sonatas are a big one. String players, you tend to skip over, violinists, you skip over Corelli's Opus 3 violin sonatas because they're so easy. But try not looking at them as easy technique, but look at them in this frame of music for us to listen to in this style. Give them a fresh look. Bach wrote plenty of sonatas, keyboard sonatas, sonatas for solo instruments, and the German composer that came up on my list is Bieber, B-I-B-E-R, not the other one. This Bieber, I would suggest giving a listen to. There are plenty more. Those of you who have done some early music sonatas, you could point them out to your friends. The development of harmonic progression, chords, progressions, as an accepted, orally understood means of composing, allowed somebody like Bach, among others, to write sonatas for one instrument. This doesn't sound weird to you because those of you who are instrumentalists, you play stuff for one instrument all the time. But think about it. Up till we sort of expect now that we have a melody instrument and a basso continuo bass line plus everybody else filling in, maybe the right hand of the harpsichord is filling in. We've got multiple people going on. However, the development of harmonic progression and of string instruments, for example, the new violin family, I'll tell you about that in a minute, allows somebody like Bach to write sonatas for a solo instrument, and like cello or violin, and imply through the string writing both that continuous linear bass line and an active moving melody line intertwining. It's not just one strand, even it's one person playing it, but it implies here's a melody bass line, they pop in and out, they interweave, and yet it's just one person. Partly that is possible for violin and cello repertoire because of the range of the four strings on these instruments. The tighter winding, or the tighter tension of the strings, I think, allows low strings to be quite different. You can get higher strings, higher pitches. And also the raised bridge. I believe this is, correct me if I'm wrong, this is the time when the bridge of the stringed instruments is raised and more curved, so you can get over these instruments. The bridge of a gamba is flat, which means you could play chords, But if you're trying to have a really high melody part and a really low bass line part, you kind of need more difference between them. They have to be higher, more brilliant, lower, warmer. And by curving the bridge, it means more work for the bow arm, but you can get that to happen. And so I hope to have a demonstration for you in class with Professor Warner and I playing one of the Bach sonatas. But when you listen to the solo cello sonata example, you want to think about that you are hearing not just the one line ostensibly that's on the page. Look, it's just one melody, nothing else, but it's implying melody, bass line, and a whole lot of harmony. Yay, Bach. Oh, great. They're cutting the grass across the street. That's fantastic. My second genre here, concerto. The concerto being a genre developing... Oh, rats. My laptop just went dead. So much for that. The concerto genre developing for instruments that tends to feature, doesn't have to, but tends to feature solo instruments versus non-solo instruments. That's how it starts off its life. Composers of concerti are people like Corelli, Vivaldi, Telemann, but Handel, Bach, I mean, everybody wrote concerti. It was the thing to do. A concerto as a genre in Baroque period has generally falls by the time we sort of sort ourselves out after 1700. It generally has 3 movements. First movement is fast. Second movement is slow tempo. Third movement is fast. In the fast movements, the movement is organized primarily, especially Vivaldi sort of makes this popular, but it's not just him, is organized around a ritornello, a refrain, a musical section that keeps coming back. It starts off everybody together, playing all together this sort of, yay, this theme song, if you will. Let's all play together. The ritornello can be transposed to different keys and appear throughout the movement. By the end, the ritornello will close the piece in the tonic key, close the movement in the tonic key. In the middle of this fast movement, for example, then we will have episodes that will feature the solo instrument or instruments, could be 2, could be 3, they will be accompanied by a reduced force. So the solo instruments are doing their melodic, cool, intertwining, fantastically brilliant melodic things, accompanied by the continuo band, like me and the bassoon and the cello, playing our bass line, and maybe my right hand playing a few chords. Maybe we'll let the violas sort of chip in and fill in a couple harmony notes. But the other first violins and second violins sit. Now is not your time. You must not play now. It is for the fantastically brilliant soloists to play. Shh. It doesn't just have to be violins that are the solo instruments. There are some concerti. I just played one with the Baroque ensemble last year that had 7 solo parts. Solo cello, oboe, flute. I mean, we actually had to figure out it was hard to figure out who was solo and who was not solo by the time we were done. We're like, are you solo? I don't know. I think so. I think you're a solo. So you can have as many solo parts as you wish. They don't have to be the same instruments either. They could blend. There's a lovely Bach double concerto for oboe and violin, for example, as well as the Bach double concerto for 2 violins as the solo instruments. The group that is the join in when everybody's playing is called the ripieno. That means the whole crowd, everybody playing, versus the solo group. Somebody like Corelli could write a concerto called a concerto grosso, which means that there's no just solo instruments. It's a work where everybody in the first violin section plays the solo material, and then we have the ritornello, and so there's less division between groups of actual people. What I was going to quote from my laptop, and I'm glad I read it before it died, was that in the Baroque period, there was very much a hierarchy of society. The violins, and especially the solo violins, were at the top of society, and the oboes and the trumpets. And then you had the ripieno violins and the violas, And then you had the cellos were sort of, okay, you can be continuo, but you could also be solo. And then there were all the other weird instruments, like bassoons, continuo. Yeah, you could sometimes be solo. Horns start to appear as actual solo instruments by the end of the Baroque period, but we don't trust them very much. They're too loud. Trumpets, one of you, just one, because two is too loud. That's military music. So we have this definite sort of codification. If you were a ripieno violinist, it meant you were good enough to play along with the chorus in Handel Messiah stuff, but we don't really trust you to play solo bits. It was a real sort of statement of your ability. Wow. So both Vivaldi and Corelli do write some of their concerti that ask everyone to be the soloist. Notice they're writing a bit later in the Baroque period. I think the ripieno violins got a little bit miffed and said, I can play that, just let me play it. The slow movement of a concerto is the one in which we might feel the affect, the emotion the most clearly. Vivaldi in the Four Seasons concerti, for example, which are kind of gimmicky pieces, really. They're great, don't get me wrong, I love them, but they're kind of gimmicky. He really goes over the top and sort of makes it almost as if it were something that were sung. Excuse me. It sounds kind of aria-like, or a slow recitative accompagnato kinds of things. Slow movements in concerti almost always end on a 5 chord. That's why it's very hard to play just a slow movement for a concerto competition. First of all, it's not flashy. Second of all, it ends on a dominant chord, and it's really asking to be joined by the following. It really belongs with the final fast movement. The final fast movement would also have the ritornello idea in it. There could be some fugue in a concerto, but I don't really feel like fugue is all that common in a concerto versus in a symphony, which we're going to talk about that in a moment. The orchestra of a concerto, I've already talked about the solo versus ripieno. Interestingly, in some of the earlier concertos, or in the 1600s, there wouldn't even be the viola parts and second violin parts wouldn't be written out. You'd just sort of figure it out, probably I think you would look at the figured bass and you'd say, okay, I know what those chords are going to be, I'll fill in my part. That's how unimportant the counterpoint of those inner parts was, yet the harmonic content of those parts, the verticalities, was important. So yeah, we're going to hire you, viola, second violin, show up. Play something. Play during the ripieno. What do I play? Well, here's the figured bass. I mean, you can figure it out, right? You know how to read figured bass. That's how that would have worked. By the time we get to the end of the High Baroque, 1700 and onward, people are generally writing out all of the parts. I guess because people are losing the ability to interpret figured bass if they are not an actual keyboard player. The latest concerto works by Vivaldi and Telemann show hints of a new style coming on the horizon, the style galant, a more gallant, light-hearted style than the sort of what had become a very heavy, elaborate Baroque style. This is a herald for the upcoming classical period. There's going to be a period of transition, pre-classical stuff that we'll be talking about in class. And we start to hear hints of that in Vivaldi and Telemann's latest works. Remember that the music history divisions that we memorize, this is when it ended, this is when it started, that wasn't actually how things happened. Things flowed.